Louise Bedford here, your host of the Talking Trading podcast. This is how traders excel. Now, if you have known me for a very, very, very long time, which probably only equates to 1% of the people listening to Talking Trading, you'll know that I had a business that I started up with a very experienced person in personnel, and I ran that business into the ground. But just before I ran it into the ground, my business partner at that stage, Jo, she put up her father's house as collateral, and that was too much for me. I said, gosh, no, it's far too big a step. I want out. And I pulled out, and she did blame me for the business going down. Now, she totally stuffed her credit rating. It was years and years before she recovered. She didn't have anybody to help her. It was really staggering around in the wilderness, and it was such a critical time for her, just at the time when all of her friends were going out and finding their careers and enjoying themselves so that they could actually achieve and get those promotions. There she was, stuck in the dark, trying to manage her credit rating, and it was just appalling to watch. And that, my friends, is exactly why I have invited a friend of mine, Graham Doessel, onto the show. Now, Graham and I have known each other for quite a while. That means we are actual friends, and you know, sometimes friends swear. So I am putting a swearing warning on this to give Graham permission to be himself. Now, Graham, I know you've focused on credit score improvement and helping brokers find the right lender. Now, I'm interested in your thoughts about getting early release and full pardon from credit prison today, and that will be our topic of conversation. Before we actually kick off with some questions, Graham, what are your thoughts about Jo's situation, and have you seen that type of situation before where people just decimate their credit rating?
Well, good morning, Louise. And yes, we are friends, and thank you for the invite. We're having a lot of fun today. Jo's situation, it's unfortunately not uncommon. In fact, every morning, not this morning, but every morning, I have a meeting with my team, and we talk about the kind of files we're dealing with. And just this morning, I was talking with one of my team members about exactly the same situation. In Jo's situation, the issue of the business going down probably haunted her for about 10 years, because if it was a proprietary limited company and that company goes bust, that stays on your credit file for 10 years that the company went into administration, et cetera, et cetera. What makes it even worse, though, is your credit file could have also been negatively affected, and you may not have even known about it. And that's the situation that happened that I was talking to a team member about this morning. The issue that we're trying to solve right now, and we've got a solution, is that she sold the company. It was in good standing. She sold the company and moved on. The new director took out a loan with a commercial short-term lender and then defaulted. There was a default put on the company credit file. She had nothing to do with it. It all happened after she left the company, after she sold the company. The debt was defaulted on, and then it was taken to court, and default judgment was also applied. Now she's trying to, and this happened in 2020, she is now trying to get another business loan and can't, because the creditors are checking her past commercial history. And that is showing that a company that she was a director of has a judgment and a default. Now, what makes it even worse is that company is also deregistered, and it is still affecting her credit today. It's horrendous how these things happen.
It really is. And Graham, I'm loving the work that you're doing through Legal Practice Holdings Group. I know your two main websites are mycralawyers.com.au and adslaw.com.au. I want to delve into this in a deeper way today. A lot of traders, they think it's just the money that they earn. They don't realize it's the money that they keep and their reputation that can make all the difference for their asset accumulation. And of course, that involves wealth creation down the track as well. So what is a credit rating, and why do you think it's important for traders to protect their identity by looking after their own credit ratings?
Oh, A credit rating, when you say what is a credit rating, in fact, we have more than a credit rating in Australia. A lot of people that listen to your podcast are probably business people or want to be business people. Those that aren't will have 3 credit files. Those that are will have 4. And there are 3 consumer credit reporting bodies in Australia: Equifax, Ilion, and Experian. And each one of those credit reporting bodies keeps a file on you, and that is your credit file, your credit report, or your credit rating. Each one of those also has a credit score that is developed by their own algorithms. Unfortunately, a lot of people believe a lot of the hype that we have on the interweb that says that you get a credit card and you pay it off quickly and you get a good credit score. In Australia, that doesn't work. This is all American stuff. So your credit rating or credit file is a history of your credit activities over the last 10 years. Generally speaking, things like we were talking about with the issue with Joe, a company issue will stay on your credit file for 10 years. And then you've got things like defaults, inquiries, late repayments, how much credit you've applied for, all of those things, even your address, your where you work, your companies you're involved in, that's all recorded in your credit file, and it's all available for any creditor to see with you just giving authority.
And it's so scary because you don't even know how it will impact you. I think that a lot of traders, even though we can use leverage with the items that we trade, such as CFDs and options, some people go for margin loans. They borrow money from other sources to be able to trade. And that is where you can trip up with your credit rating as well as a trader. So I think maintaining this idea that looking after every aspect of your wealth is definitely the best way to go. And you've mentioned the term credit prison. Now, that's such a very restrictive thought, isn't it? I'd love you to talk about this and talk more about how the Australian credit reporting system works and why you believe it's unfair for honest Australians.
Well, credit prison is a phrase we've used a number of times, and it comes back to what you said earlier about your reputation. You've got a credit reputation, and if your credit reputation is destroyed, you are effectively put into credit prison. There are so many strict rules and regulations around your credit and how your credit reputation impacts everything else that you're bound. You get shackled, and there's nothing you can do about it unless you know the right people. And then sometimes there's still nothing you can do about it, unfortunately, depending on what the level of circumstance is. So with the credit prison concept is, you imagine that, I don't know, you want to go for a margin loan and you've got, I don't know, $500,000 that you want to put into the market. And the margin loan, you know more about the margin stuff than I do. You want to go and get a facility to give you access to money. As soon as the creditor checks your credit file, that will immediately put a mark on your credit file, which will lower your score. It says you are now credit active and that it records the fact that you're making an inquiry. You might decide, oh, no, they're a bit dear, so I'll go and I'll shop around. And you go and apply for 2 or 3 more loans to find the right facility. It might not be a traditional margin loan. It could just be a personal loan. It could be, you might, heaven forbid, get a credit card and use that money. Probably wouldn't be something would be taught to do, but I'm sure people have tried to do it. Every single time you make an inquiry that goes in your credit score, on your credit file, every single time you do that, it lowers your credit score. So now we're getting a situation where you're being hemmed in because you've got too many inquiries. At a very near point, most lenders will simply start to say no as soon as you make the inquiry because you've got too many inquiries. It starts to lower your score and reduce your options. And then let's say that, oh, geez, you now need money for something and you can't get it. Heaven forbid you get a default. The default means that most lenders will simply say, oh, no way, not a hope in heck. Didn't swear. Not a hope in heck. And now all of a sudden that you're getting, the noose is getting tighter and tighter. If for whatever reason you can't pay that default, it goes one level further and the creditor could take you to court, get default judgment. Now that noose is really tight. Now you've got a court order saying you owe the money. And this is where the credit prison really starts to come in. For some people, just having one inquiry from a payday lender completely destroys their credit file to the extent they can't get a home loan. Others, they can get through with a default and a few inquiries and stuff like this, but they can't get the loans they want. They just have to get a loan they need. And that might mean it has to be at a much higher rate of interest, or they have to go to some of the loan sharks or some of the commercial short-term lenders.
Oh, and once you've got that domino effect, it's so hard to escape.
It is a spiral.
Yes, it is absolutely. And you've had a lot of success removing people's credit defaults from their files. How do you do that?
Well, theoretically, if you go to somewhere like ASIC's website, they say, oh, don't trust credit repairers because the credit reporting system is such that you can only get something removed if there's a mistake. And that's exactly how we do it. That's spot on. The creditors have an obligation. If you're borrowing money as a consumer, the creditors have an obligation to meet a massive list of legislative requirements before they're allowed to list you as a defaulter. And that goes right back to the start. When you first are applying for finance of any kind, the Privacy Act says that the creditor must, at or before the time they're taking or recording your initial information, they must give you a set of warnings, basically. And these warnings say what's going to happen with your details, how you might be reported, and 99% of them don't do that. So we go right back to the basics. We'll have a look at the original contract. We'll have a look at whether they met this particular obligation. If they have met that, if the contract is okay, we then go so much further and say, we want a copy of all of your internal file notes. We want a copy of all of the letters sent and received, copy of all the actual telephone recordings, because most creditors, they tell lies. They make up documents. Not all, of course. If you're a creditor watching this and you think that it's not you, then of course it's not you. It's the other guy that does this. Yeah, right. The obligation on the creditor is onerous. They have a massive amount of work they've got to do to make sure that the default listing has been done correctly. They just don't do it. We were talking to a friendly debt buyer some time ago, and they said they can't afford to do it. If we were to remove 10,000 defaults a year, and I'd like that, we don't remove 10,000 defaults a year, but if we were to remove 10,000 defaults a year, we wouldn't even scratch the top of the surface of the film of the drop of the bottom of the bucket. There are so many defaults. Companies, there are some telcos out there that put 50,000 defaults a year alone. Just one telco.
Oh my gosh. And it doesn't sound like this is something that you can have as a one size fits all. From what you've said, you're having to really look at each person individually and holistically go into their well-being to be able to resolve their issue.
Well, the idea of removing a default is simple. Either the creditor did the right thing and followed the legislation, or they didn't. When it comes down to the nitty-gritty, it really is on a case-by-case basis. We need to know the background, like what happened to you before the default was listed? Where were you mentally? Where were you financially in the 6 months leading up to it? Because if you normally pay your bills on time and all of a sudden you're not, that's actually a red flag for the creditor to reach out and offer you hardship. They've got a positive obligation to offer you hardship, and they don't. So we need to know everything that happened. And once we know what happened, we can then formulate our initial request letter to the creditor to make sure that it addresses those issues. And this is one of the reasons we can sometimes get defaults removed the same day we request the initial information, because we've been dealing with these same creditors for 14 years. They know we don't give up just because it gets hard. They know that we're a law firm. They know that the obligations on them are onerous. And if it's shown over and over again that they're not doing the right thing, if it's a systemic breach, they could be fined millions of dollars from the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the Privacy Commissioner. They could get millions of dollars in fines. They could have their credit license revoked. They could have their ability to check credit files revoked. So these days, when they get a letter from My Australia Lawyers, most of them just say, oh, okay, shit, I'll remove that one, move on, and it's done. But for those watching that might need a hand to do their own credit file, we get a copy of all of the files, as I said before, right down to telephone recordings. And we then compare that against up to 8,000 pages of legislation, which includes the National Consumer Credit Protection Act, there's a number of banking acts and regulations, the Privacy Act, of course, and the privacy regulations. And then there's a number of ombudsmen who have their own rulings and determinations. We go through all of that. Well, actually, we don't now. We only have to look at the legislation when it gets really difficult, because we know it. We've got checklists this long of, did they do this? Did they do this? Did they do this? And it's pretty scary.
Which is why it's difficult to do for yourself. Like if you're trying to manage that yourself, to have knowledge in this arena it's almost exclusively for people who are focused on that region. I think it's impossible to be the master of all things. And the thing is as well, for everybody listening, this may not be your situation, but it could be your friends, it could be your neighbors, it could be your child's. And if you don't help them resolve their situation, then shame on you, because there are ways to fix these types of things. I did read that you've got a case with NAB, that NAB had a default on one of your clients and you got that default removed in 71 days. Was that correct?
Yes, it is. And for a major bank, that's a pretty impressive event. Having said that, though, we haven't published all of our case studies, and just recently another one was removed from ANZ in less than 2 weeks. And Citibank used to be one of the hardest defaults to remove, but they're now coming down to 2 weeks to a month. And it's just about knowing the legislation. Like you're saying, there are a lot of people out there that don't understand this system. Even some brokers today still say, I'm not going to deal with clients with bad credit because they're not the right sort of client for me. They don't quite fit my personal niche. And that's okay until they get a default themselves. And they, well, I'm never going to default or pay my bills on time. Yeah, we find that most people that we work with aren't bad people. They are people who have made a single mistake. And it could be simply, you sell the house you're in now and you buy a new one. You need to cut off the power where you currently live and put the power on in the new place. So you ring your energy company and say, oi, on this date, cut off the power. Sorry, on this date, put the power on, so I'm moving to the new place. A week later, cut off the power in the old place. I'm moving to the new place, 123 Smith Street, Smithville. Right? All good. You've notified them of your new address. You've notified them to cut off the power, and you move. And then the final bill for the electricity goes to the old address because the person on the phone didn't update the details in two separate areas, not just one. Or they didn't update the gas as well as the power. And this is so common. We actually had the CEO of a major energy company get a default from her own company when she left because her people didn't put it in the right spot. Oof. And she said, I know our systems. It's too hard for me to do. Can you just fix it? Really? Okay, yep, we'll fix it. You want to pay me money for something you should be able to do on the phone, I'll definitely do it for you. No problem.
Oh my gosh. And
scary.
I think that's it too, is that things have become so complicated. There are so many layers of friction in everything we do. Nothing's transparent anymore. Business used to be done on a handshake, my friend, but not now. So what about for individuals that are looking to fix this themselves? Give us an idea of the steps that they should take so they can start finding their way through this jungle.
Step one is to actually know what the problem is. So get a copy of your Equifax credit file, get a copy of your Illion credit file. And if you can, get a copy of your Experian credit file. Go directly to the source with Equifax, Illion and Experian rather than getting it from third parties. If you get it from third parties, you'll often be on their mailing list now and you're going to get all these loan offers and goodness knows what else. Once you've got the credit files, open them up and have a look. If your credit score is low, you might have to pay for your credit score. If you get the free copy, often you'll get the credit file without the score. So that's just a little extra tidbit. But if you open the credit file, go through and have a look at the indicators in the top right. Normally, there is an indicator with an Equifax credit file. We'll focus on the Equifax now. We'll focus in the top right. There's an indicator box that says the reasons your score is where it is, or the reasons your score is above average, below average, whatever else. Have a look at that. It'll say too many inquiries or adverse credit or whatever else. Scroll down through and have a look. Well, how many inquiries have I got in total in the last 5 years? How many of those are in the last 2 years? Some lenders really only look at the last 2 years. But then have a look at, have I got any payday lenders or buy now, pay later lenders? Those two will significantly impact your score just because you made the inquiry, even if you didn't take the finance. The next worst type of inquiry is a credit card inquiry. And then it comes down to, well, are these inquiries bunched together? Okay. So there's a few nuances you've got to get your head around. But if you've only got 3 inquiries in the last 12 months, but they're all in the last 2 weeks, that's going to seriously negatively impact your score. Whereas if those same 3 inquiries were over 3 or 4 months apart, it'll have less of an impact on your score. Then go down and have a look. Have I got any defaults? Have I got any late repayments? So late repayments, for those who still don't know out there, are the most horrendous thing that's been added to a credit file in the last 50 years. They haven't even been around 50 years. The late repayment is if you make a payment of, say, your credit card, your car loan, something like that, more than 14 days late, it is mandated by law, the creditor must add that to your credit file as a late payment. Now, the concept here, by those who sit in their ivory towers who don't know how the real world works, was that in 2013, there was I was having a conversation with 4BC in Brisbane about how this was going to work. And the Privacy Commissioner came on and said, oh, this is going to be a fantastic thing for consumers. Those who pay their bills on time, all the good people out there, they'll get offered lower rates of interest and it'll be fantastic for the consumer in the community. And I said, when he finished, well, I think what's going to happen in the real world is that if you miss a payment, they're going to treat you like a leper. And if you make your payments on time, they're just going to say, well, you get the normal rates because that's what you're supposed to do anyway. You're not going to get any special treatment. The next day, the phone's lit up, of course, because it was a talkback station and we're answering questions for 20 minutes. The next day, there was this nasty little article in the paper, in the Courier Mail in Brisbane, about how bad credit repair agencies were because they don't know what's going on.
He took revenge.
And he did. He's no longer the Privacy Commissioner, so that's all right. And anyway, what happened was that the creditors didn't want to use this credit reporting part, the late repayment history information. It's just too hard. They didn't want to worry about it. And then because the legislation came in 2014. 2018, it was mandated that people had to start doing it. Still didn't come in. And then it's now law and penalties apply if creditors don't provide the information. And what has actually happened is, unfortunately, I had a crystal ball, because now what happens is if you have a single payment that's more than 14 days late and it goes on your credit file, most lenders will take a step back and say, oh, okay, doesn't pay his bills on time. What do we have to look a bit further in this? Heaven forbid you have a situation where you've missed a couple of payments, because now you've got historical evidence you're a late payer. If you just have clean, they just treat you like anybody else. Yeah, it's good. You're paying your bills on time. The information is wrong in the way it's recorded.
First step really for people is to work out where they stand. So you're going to get your Equifax credit information to see whether you have any defaults recorded against you, and you'll have a look to see how your credit history looks.
Yes.
And then what do you do?
So then once you've identified any issues on there, contact the creditor and ask them for a please explain. Why have I got this on here? If you know you paid late, then the please explain would be very simple. And it might be a case of, I didn't get a default notice. Please send me a copy of all of the notices you sent me because I'm going to dispute this default. Ask for a copy of all of their internal notes. They'll tell you to bugger off, but they have a legal obligation to give it to you. They just don't want to. Ask for a copy of all of the files that are about or could likely to be perceived to be about you. That's what it says in the legislation. Get a copy of everything and then go through that looking for, hang on, I didn't get this notice, or I didn't get this notice, and make them prove they sent it to the right address. Like using the energy company example from before, if you notify the creditor of your updated address and they send it to the old address just because they stuffed their systems, that's not your fault. That's their fault, and they have to remove the default. If they said to you on the telephone, pay it and we'll remove the default, or pay it before this date and you won't get a default, and you did that and you still got a default anyway, or you paid it and they didn't remove the default, you've got then a copy of the telephone call to say, hang on, we had an obligation here. You said this, I did my part, you've got to do your part.
So this is where you've turned into the antagonistic private investigator. You're looking for logic flaws, you're looking for evidence that you could not have known, or that you tried to do the right thing, but the right thing didn't actually result in lack of a default being recorded. And so after you've tackled them, what do you do?
Once you found a reason, and it's not unusual to find 14 individual breaches in any one default listing. So the average consumer may not be able to find that many, but they should be able to find several. Once you find those breaches, write to the creditor and say, you've breached the legislation here, 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 and here. Please remove the default. It's unlawful. And a lot of the times they will. If they don't, you can probably take it to AFCA, Australian... I know AFCA, I've lost it. It'll come back to me in a minute. But AFCA, and send it to AFCA and file a complaint saying that, here, I've found all of these reasons the default shouldn't be there. If you go to AFCA and ask them to do the investigation, what they'll primarily do is write to the creditor and say, dear Mr. Creditor, did you do the right thing? And the creditor comes back and says, yep.
Yes.
Well, yep. And of course, they'll side with the creditor. If you provide the evidence that you've found, you've got a much better chance of getting the default removed. Sometimes you can just simply write to the credit reporting body and get them to do the investigation. Again, unfortunately, what they primarily do is write to the creditor and say, dear Mr. Creditor, it's an obligation under your subscription that you must do these things. Did you do them? The creditor will always write back and say, yes, I did, because otherwise they can have their subscription revoked.
And then if all of this sounds a little bit too hard, because it could be like my friend Jo, who probably got deluged with so many decisions at that time of her life. It really would have been great if I had have known you back then, Graham. Funnily enough, my background is that, as you know, I worked for a credit information company. So a lot of what you're saying is resembling some sort of deep memory for me. It's going way, way back. So I'm loving this because it puts it in the hands of people who can practically apply it so that they can become better traders. And if all else fails, they can always get in touch with you through Legal Practice Holdings Group, probably the mycralawyers.com.au website would be best.
Absolutely.
Now, Graham, we're about to wrap up. Is there anything there that you feel you'd like to offer as parting advice for our listeners?
Actually, yeah, even if you think you have done everything right and have a squeaky clean credit file, check it. The law was changed recently. You're now entitled to a free credit report every 3 months from all credit reporting bodies. So just make it a regular habit to jump on and get a free copy. It doesn't negatively affect your score in any way for you getting a copy. And if you do, you will see if anything pops up. You could be the victim of identity theft or identity fraud without knowing about it until it's too late. So just check. You could have changed address and not be aware that you've got a default or someone's looking at your credit file. So just check. It's free. Protect your credit reputation. Protect your credit standing. Don't end up in credit prison just because you were too busy to check your credit rating.
Oh, I love it. So much good advice there. And Graham, once again, if you can tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Okay, so if you have an issue with your credit file, mycralawyers, mycralawyers.com.au, 1300 667 218. We'll happily have a free chat with you and just have a look at your credit file and tell you what the issues are and what you can do yourself. And if you need help, we'll happily talk about taking you on board.
Brilliant. That goes for property investors, for traders, really anybody who's trying to get by as an adult. This all comes under the adulting bucket these days, doesn't it? Graham, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. I've been meaning to get you on for ages, and I do wish you the best of luck with your future and your vision for helping ordinary people escape from credit prison. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Louise.
And for everybody listening, if you do know somebody who is in credit prison at the moment, then definitely come over to Graham and I'm sure he'll sort them out for you. Keep listening next week when I bring you another Talking Trading episode that I'm sure you're going to love. And until then, happy trading.